Welcome to the I Made a podcast, where we hear from podcasters about what they've learned since starting their own show, so you can do the same. And now, here's your host, Chris Creary.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of I Made a Podcast. I hope that you're having a good day, because I am having a great day, and we did it. We made it to the end of season number 1 of the podcast, and I'm so glad that you were here to come along this journey with me. Now, I learned a lot of things from all of the podcasters that I spoke to in this season. It was so amazing, and I've implemented so many things in my own podcast to get some more traction and engagement, and even shorten the workflow that I had concerning my podcast. I learned so much. So what I'm going to do in this episode is I'm going to go over all of the things that I learned from all of the podcasters that I spoke to this season. And I'm going to highlight the number one thing that I learned from every single one of my conversations with them. So you're in for a summary episode of everything that I learned from season number 1. If you listen to this and you want to be on season number 2, just fill out that form in the description and I'll reach out to you and contact you, and then we'll set something up so that you can have an opportunity to share your story about your podcast on this podcast. And it's going to be great. I would love to connect with you. So check the link in the description in order to get in touch with me for season number 2. Now, without further ado, let's get into this episode today. I'm going to do a recap of everybody that I've spoken to and highlight one key thing that I learned from everybody. So first, starting off with my very first interview that I released, it was with Alan Wofford, and he has a podcast called The Diary of a Bald Man. And it's an amazing podcast. What I learned from him was that it's okay to look at the analytics and make decisions about when to release new episodes. You might need to change your strategy based on what you see in your analytics. So take time to study your analytics and understand, and don't be afraid to test certain things out with regards to your release date, time, or schedule, or how often you release new episodes. That's what I learned from Alan Wofford. Again, his podcast is called Diary of a Bald Man. Next, I interviewed Jay Hall. Now, he has a podcast called the Okie Bookcast, where he interviews authors who write books about Oklahoma, who are from Oklahoma. One of the amazing things that he shared with me was about this tool called Alphonic. Now, it's a tool that is used to remove background noises and all these other sounds from your podcast and to level out the audio. So if you're interviewing someone and their levels are a little bit lower than yours, you can use this tool to level out the audio. So this was a tool that I learned from him, and I've used it on so much of my podcast episodes. And it's also on my cheat sheet. So go and download my cheat sheet, and you can have access to this tool and so many more. Now, after my conversation with Jay, I spoke to Heidi Dela Cruz. Now, her podcast is called The American Dream in the Eyes of Immigrants. Now, she has a video podcast, and this was the first time that I spoke to someone with a video podcast. So I was really asking a whole bunch of questions to understand why do video and not just audio. But her response was you can repurpose that video on so many other platforms, on Facebook, on YouTube, on Instagram, and not just have the audio content. So this was my first discussion with a podcaster to talk about why video podcasting, or at least capturing the video of your podcast, is so important when you're doing a podcast. And that one was released on January 17th. Now, after my conversation with Heidi, I talked to Sean DeHart. Now, he has 2 podcasts. One of them is called Rock by Faith, and the other podcast is called Journeys of a Homeschool Dad. Now, through my conversations with Sean, we touched on how AI is invading podcasting and how it can either make your life easier as a podcaster or maybe even replace you. It's getting kind of scary, but AI is here and we need to learn how to use technology to make things easier for us. I don't think it's at the place yet where it can replace us completely, but definitely we need to stay up on the trends with regards to technology and make sure that we are utilizing these tools to make things easier for us to produce our content. Now, after my conversation with Sean, I talked to Matt Williams. My interview with him was on February 7th, and he has a podcast called The Original Geek Podcast. It's a combination of 2 words, jock and geek, and he talks about things like entertainment, comics, video games, wrestling, a whole bunch of other stuff, and he has a co-host named Unique DNA. It's a great podcast. I would encourage you to go check it out. Now, my conversation with him was full of knowledge and insight because he's been podcasting for such a long time. Now, one of the things that I learned from him is that there is a website that you can go to get free tools and resources as podcasters that can help you. And you can get all these tools and access them and use them for free. So absolutely, I put the links that he shared with me on my podcasting cheat sheet. So go download it and you can have access to these tools as well. Now, I had a conversation on February 14th with Big Z, and he has the podcast called True Chicago Sports Fans. He actually has two podcasts. He has that podcast and the new podcast that he just started this past year called Impodsicated. Amazing conversation that I had with him. Now, one of the things that jumped out to me through my conversation with him is how it's important to make genuine connections with people, and it's all about relationships. So in all that you're doing with your podcast, see how you can reach out and make genuine connections with people and see how you can serve them, and likewise they will be there when you need them. All right, so on February 21st, I spoke to Abigail and Keith, and they have a podcast called the Global Treasures Podcast. And it's a great podcast that you can listen to if you're interested in travel and history. Now, they talk about the UNESCO World Heritage Sites. And the amazing thing that I learned from them is the way that their content is structured, because UNESCO designates different sites as World Heritage Sites every single year. So each season that they have of their podcast is literally a year, and it covers all of the sites that were designated as World Heritage Sites for that year. And it's an amazing way to structure your podcast content and your seasons and your episodes. And I think it was really creative for Abigail and Keith to structure their podcast this way. Now, moving on to February 28th, I interviewed Kurt Sasso. Now, he has been podcasting since 2008. So he has been doing this for such a long time. His podcast is called Two Geeks Talking. Now, while we were talking, we were recording and things were going wonderful. And he was answering one of his questions about the gear that he has. And lo and behold, my computer decided to run an update and shut off. And I would have lost the entire recording. But he was recording on his side, and I actually had the backups. He sent them to me afterwards, and we were still able to keep everything that we recorded. So the key takeaway and what I learned from this conversation with Kurt was to always have backups. And I can't stress that enough. As podcasters, always make sure that you have backups. Now, moving into the month of March, I interviewed Tiffany Rochelle, and this was the kickoff to International Women's Month. So I wanted to honor some female podcasters for the month of March for International Women's Month. So Tiffany Rochelle has a podcast called Hear My Heart. Now, her podcast is really good, and she is so encouraging when you hear her speak. Now, you can go back and listen to my interview that I did with her, but one of the things that she said to me that really stuck with me was you can take a break, but don't stop. If you know that there's something that you're supposed to do, you can take a break, regroup, but don't stop doing what you're doing. And another thing that she shared from the best episode that she's ever done was to make every second count. Your life can change in a moment, so make sure that you're making impact with everything that you're doing. My next conversation was with Tabitha Thorell. This was released on March 13th. Now, Tabitha has a podcast called What Went Wrong. I love the name, and we had a wonderful conversation. Now, through my conversation with Tabitha, what jumped out to me was that we need to learn how to tell our story of impact, determination, and resilience. It's important that we know how to tell our story and tell it clearly and to the point so that it can resonate with the people that are listening to it on the other side. One of the other key things that I learned from my conversation with Tabitha was that you don't need to be a one-man show. You can hire people to do things that are not one of your strengths. And Tabitha does this really well. She has a team that she works with her podcast. So she just records her podcast and her team takes care of the rest. Now, my next conversation was on March 20th, and it was with Dr. Shaniqua Johnson, aka Shaniqua Inspires. Now, one of the things that she shared with me during our conversation was how to be locked and loaded when it comes to your podcast, how to batch work together so when you can have focused time and do a whole bunch of work concerning your podcast, record it, edit it, schedule it to be released, and then wipe your hands and then enjoy your content. Sit back and watch it or listen to it. But when you can find focused time in your schedule where you can put towards your podcast and do a whole bunch of episodes, record them, schedule them, and then everything is locked and loaded, you can sit back and enjoy it and engage with people as you release it. This is a good strategy for podcasters who have busy lives. So this is something that you could employ if you are a podcaster and you do a lot of things and have a lot of things on the go. Now, on March 27th, I spoke to Dawn Wecker. Her podcast is called Dawnversations. Now, this conversation that I had with Dawn really blew my mind because she shared something with me that I didn't expect. Now, she has been recording her podcast with her cell phone in a closet for over 100 episodes. And it was remarkable because I listened to some of the episodes that she released using her cell phone in her closet, and they sound amazing. So I was totally blown away by the audio quality that she was able to get. But this tells me that she was practicing good technique when it comes to recording. And it was so wonderful to hear her testimony when it comes to podcasting, how she was doing it using her cell phone. So I want to encourage you that if you only have a cell phone to record your podcast, you can use your cell phone and you can get good sounding audio. And Dawn proved it. So go listen to Dawn's podcast. It's called Dawnversations. It's a wonderful podcast. You'll learn a lot and you'll laugh a lot from some of the things and some of the people that she's talked about and some of the things that she says. It's a wonderful podcast. She's a great podcaster. So go check out her podcast. Now, moving into the month of April, I spoke to Rena Friedman Watts. Now, she has a wonderful podcast. Rena is just an awesome person, period. Like, she's just totally awesome. But her podcast is called Better Call Daddy, and her dad comes in at the end of the podcast to give his 2 cents, put his wisdom or his spin on things. It's a wonderful podcast. I would encourage you to listen to that podcast. Now, one of the things that I learned from listening to Rena's podcast is that we need to learn as podcasters how to ask good questions. Because if we ask good questions to the people that we're interviewing, they'll be able to give us good answers, and those good answers will turn into good content, and it will lead to an engaging audience where people will listen and be engaged to how the person that you are interviewing is answering those questions. But it all starts by asking good questions, and Rena does this so well on her podcast, Better Call Daddy. Go check out her podcast. It's really great. Now, on April 17th, I interviewed Daylene Higgins. Her podcast is called Wealthy After 40, and her podcast focuses on helping those people who are 40 plus. Maybe they didn't save for their retirement, but how to finish wealthy. And she's a financial coach. And one of the big things, a huge light bulb moment for me when speaking with her, she just kind of brushed over it, but I had to pause on it, that she, in her first year of her podcast, had over 30,000 downloads. Now, that is a really huge accomplishment that she had on her podcast. And as we continue to talk, the light bulb went off because I realized why she was able to do that. She hired a marketing coach and a podcasting coach. And then I realized that the other podcasters that I've spoken to, that was a common thread. The podcasters that really made an impact and had lots of downloads, they actually hired a coach, either a podcast coach or a marketing coach, someone to help them and guide them along the way. And it only came as a light bulb moment while I was speaking to Daylene Higgins. So go check out her podcast, Wealthy After 40. And if you are a podcaster, if you haven't hired a podcasting coach, I would suggest that you do that so you can get your podcast from just being average to the next level. Now, on April 24th, I had an interview with Laura Lasensky. Her podcast is called Travel Along with Laura. Now, it's very unique the way that she does her podcast because she travels to different locations, but instead of her just explaining what she is seeing or going through or what she's done on these different locations, she actually has an audio recorder with her and captures the sounds and releases it in her podcast. So while you're listening to her podcast, you're actually listening to the things that she is experiencing when she is traveling at these various locations. And it's a really cool experience because not only are you hearing what she is saying as she is explaining what's happening, but you're actually hearing what's happening. And I've never heard a podcast like this before. So go check out our podcast. It's called Travel Along with Laura, and it's on all the podcasting apps. And go listen to my interview that I did with her, and you can listen to all of the podcasting goodness that she shared and how she does her process with regards to recording all of this audio when she goes and travels. Now, moving to the month of May, I had a conversation with Danny Marie. Now, Danny Marie has a quadrillion, million, jillion podcasts. She is a podcast planning strategist, and she has so much podcasts. I can't even remember how much she has, but I'm sure I think she just started another one after I interviewed her on May 8th. But she is a podcast planning strategist, and one of the things that I learned from her, with all of the things that she does, she has created standard operating procedures that she follows to get a consistent workflow with her podcast. I mean, you can't have so much podcast and not have structure in order to get those things done. And she nails it with regards to her structure that she has for her podcast. So I would encourage you to go listen to that interview that I did with Danny Marie and connect with her on social, because she shares a lot of good, solid insight for podcasters to help them to get to the next level. On May 15th, I spoke with Amy Flanagan. Now, Amy is a communication specialist, and she has a podcast called The Savvy Communicator. And one of the things that she said in my conversation with her is that communication is a trial and error process, and so is podcasting. When you start podcasting, you're going to probably start out and you're going to think things are perfect and great, that you did a wonderful job articulating everything that you had to say. But when you reach your 100th episode and you listen back to your first episode, you realize that you grew and you learned so much through trial and error. So as you continue to podcast, just remember that you will continue to learn and grow. And it's a trial and error process. As you continue to do new things and try new ways of communicating on your podcast, you'll learn, you'll figure out what works and what doesn't work, and then you'll evolve and grow, and your podcast will be at the top of the charts in no time. But if you don't start and if you don't learn, you won't grow. So communication is a trial and error process, and so is podcasting. Now, moving right along, I spoke to Jim Savucci. Now, he has two podcasts. The first podcast is called On Leading with Greatness. It's a great podcast. I would encourage you to listen to that one. And his second podcast is called The Dylan-Tans, and where it's all about Bob Dylan. That's one of the artists that he really loves, and he has a podcast about him. But one of the things that I learned from Jim is his process with regards to On Leading with Greatness, because he is a writer. He writes essays weekly, but he actually turns those essays, he releases them as essays so people can read them, but he also releases them as podcast episodes. So he writes them, and then he reads them and records the audio of him reading his essays, and he releases that as a podcast. So people can listen to his episode as a podcast, and people can read it as an essay as well, depending on however they want to consume his content. So this was really eye-opening for me, because for those people out there who like to write a lot, but they don't have a podcast, you could easily turn your essays into podcast episodes after you write them. So this is something that I never heard of it done this way before, but kudos to Jim for turning his essays into podcasts, and that workflow is working well for him. Go back and listen to my episode with him that I released on May 22nd. Now, on May 29th, I interviewed Destiny Mackey. She is a boundary coach. Her podcast is called Boldly You. And one of the key things that I learned from my conversation with her was that it's important to take care of yourself first, so that you can be the best version of yourself for everybody else around you. And the vision that comes to mind when I say that is when you're on an airplane and they're giving you the safety instructions, they tell you to put your oxygen mask on first and then help the person beside you get theirs on second. And that's so key, because if you are not whole, if you are not well, you will not be a benefit to anyone else around you. So make sure that you set up your boundaries so that you have time for yourself, to get your mental health right, to get your physical health right, and get yourself in the right mindset to be the best version of you that you can be for yourself and for everybody else around you. And one of the other things that Destiny mentioned while I was speaking with her is that it's okay to have a pink microphone if it matches your room. She has pink paint on her walls and her microphone is pink. So if it works out for you, and if you want to have a microphone that matches your room that you record in, go for it. Now, moving into the month of June, I spoke to Ryan Speltz. Ryan has two podcasts. The first podcast is called One Man's Journey, and the other podcast is called the Reconnect Podcast. He's a real estate agent. Now, One Man's Journey is all about connecting with men so that we can share our story about manhood, so that we can encourage one another, build up one another and help another man out there who may be going through something, because men tend to suffer in silence, but by coming together and talking and sharing our experience, we could help and encourage other men. So kudos to Ryan for his podcast called One Man's Journey. Now, his other podcast is called the Reconnects Podcast, and he's actually a real estate agent, so he speaks to other real estate agents. Now, the key thing that I learned from my conversation with Ryan was the importance of reciprocity. We spoke about an author and a book called The Go-Giver. I think the author's name is Bob Burg. Oh boy, I hope I got that right. I think his name is Bob Burg or Bill Burg, but the book I know for sure is called The Go-Giver. And we talked about the law of reciprocity, which is mentioned in the book. And he does all his business by this law, and it works for him in his podcast and his business as a real estate agent. And I would encourage you to listen to my episode that I did with Ryan, released on June 12th, where we dived into it a little bit more, and go connect with him on his podcast. Now, on June 19th, I spoke with Danielle Shea. Now, she has a podcast called the Danielle Shea Podcast, and I had a great conversation with her. She is a healing coach for sexual abuse survivors. Now, one of the powerful things that she shared from my episode with her was that your story can be someone else's survival guide. And when you think about that, it is so powerful, because if you have overcome something, your story of how you have overcome can help someone who's going through that situation right now. And I would encourage you to go listen to her podcast called the Danielle Shea Podcast. And I released my interview with her on June 19th. Now, on June 26th, I spoke to Erin Harrigan. Now, her podcast is called Redefining Hustle: Navigating Success as a Christian Woman. Now, through my conversation with her, it was a wonderful conversation. We got into so much, and she has more than 5 years experience podcasting. Now, through my conversation with her, we spoke about the importance of video, and she shared the results of a 90-day video campaign on YouTube, where every day for 90 days, she shared a short video on YouTube. And I've actually tried that since speaking with her, and I've gotten some traction in my podcast as well. So I would encourage you to try it on your podcast. Now, moving into the month of July, on July 10th, I spoke with Ray. Ray has a podcast called Homeroom. Now, her podcast is about the education system, and she interviews people to get their story of how the education shaped their life. Now, her podcast, and I put air quotes because she doesn't really consider it a podcast. It's really a research project to her, where she is doing research as she's interviewing these people about the education system, hoping that she could make a difference in the education system in the future, whether it is starting a new curriculum or a new school or whatever she can find out through these interviews. I love the way that she's approaching this, where she's doing research kind of in the open and using her podcast as the platform to do it. So your podcast can be used as a vehicle for the greater good, not just to entertain or to educate people, but like Ray is doing, she could potentially use her podcast to create a curriculum in the future. And I hope that she does that. So kudos to Ray. Go check out her podcast. It's called Homeroom. And it was a wonderful conversation that I had with her, released on July 10th. Now, on July 17th, I had an interview with Bruce Chamoff. He has been podcasting since 2005. He is actually the founder of the World Podcast Network. So go look that up, and you will be able to connect with him and join the World Podcast Network. He also has a podcast called How to Become a Successful Podcaster. Now, it was wonderful, my conversation with him, because we got into so much, and there's so much similarities that he has that we have in common. It was just such a wonderful conversation. But one of the things that I learned from my conversation with him was that if you are seen as an authority in a particular area and people keep on coming to you and asking you questions, it's okay for you to start a podcast. Record those frequently asked questions down and release it as a podcast episode. And then eventually, when people ask you those questions, you can just send them your podcast link and they can listen and subscribe. And you can actually have great opportunity to monetize that knowledge and that insight that you were sharing on your podcast. So if you are seen as an authority in whichever area that you are a specialist in, you can start a podcast and you can be seen as an authority and get your content out there so it can help everybody. On July 24th, I interviewed Ty Hervey. His podcast is called Venture Tabernacle Podcast. And I love the conversation that I had with him because he has a faith-based podcast and it's similar to my other podcast, the Faith Fight podcast. So we were connecting on different levels here with my interview with him. And one of the things that he shared was that your audio needs to be top notch. By having the best quality audio in your podcast, you remove one of the most important barriers from people listening to your podcast. So with whatever you do with your podcast, try your best to have the best quality audio. Now, on July 31st, I interviewed Sam Mitchell. He has a podcast called Autism Rocks and Rolls. This conversation that I had with him, this entire episode was so wonderful, and I'm so glad that I was able to connect with Sam. One of the things that really jumped out to me about Sam was that you need to be bold and ask for what you want with regards to your podcast. He does something called a sponsorship field trip, where he goes to different areas and he goes to local businesses and asks them to sponsor his podcast, where he will receive sponsorship from these businesses and he will mention them on his podcast. And it's a wonderful thing, and he has had great success at doing it. So be bold about your podcast and ask for whatever it is that you want with regards to sponsorships. Now, on August 14th, I released an interview with Nicole Lopez, and this was a great conversation that I had with her because she's a real estate agent and I'm really passionate about real estate and investing as well. So we had a wonderful conversation. And one of the key things that I learned from her is how to build your team. She shared that one of the most downloaded episode or impactful episodes that she has of her podcast, which is called Real Estate Investing with Nicole. One of the most impactful episodes that she has is about building your real estate team. But that methodology can actually be used with regards to podcasting as well. So all she does is actually record her podcast, and she has a team of people that help her do the editing and the production of her podcast and releases it for her. And what that does is it allows you to focus on the things that are your strength, and you can allow other people to work on the things that you are not so strong in, so that they can work on their strengths and you can work on your strength. And together, everybody on your team can work together and have the best quality content and put it out there for people to listen. And this is working very well for Nicole. So build your team. Don't do it all by yourself if you're not strong in all of those areas that causes us podcast to be successful. Now, on August 21st was the last interview that I did for season number 1. This was just last week. And this interview was with Misha Watson. She has a podcast called My Single Story. Now, this was an amazing conversation that I had. Go back and listen to it. It was just last week. And she has over 13 years of experience in media, like television. And she's been doing her podcast for about 2 years. So she downloaded all of this insight about her experience in media, tools and tips, and specifically social media and how to use it. So one of the key things that I learned from my conversation with Misha was, who is your content for? You need to keep that in mind as you are doing all the work about your podcast. Understand who is it for. And with your social media account, you need to understand how you are using those social media accounts. And are you utilizing those social media accounts to cater to those strengths of those accounts? For example, Instagram is mainly video and good polished images. Or is your content good quality content that caters to be good quality content on Instagram? As an example, you have to understand those social media platforms and make sure that you are giving those platforms the best type of content that are catered for those platforms. And that's it. That brings us to the end of season number 1. And these are the top things that I learned from everybody that I spoke to. So I summarized the entire season in this season finale episode. So if you learned anything from this episode, please go back and listen to any of the past episodes with any of the podcasters that I spoke about. It will help you dramatically get a better podcast. I learned a lot about podcasting. I've been podcasting 5 years before I started this podcast, but I learned so much through my conversation with the podcasters that I spoke to on this podcast. Now, again, if you want to be on I Made a Podcast in season number 2, which starts in January, I have a link in the description of this episode. You can go there and you can fill out your information, and I will be in touch with you because I want to get your story on I Made a Podcast so we can learn what you know about podcasting and share it with the world so that we can all become better podcasters. And one of the things that helps you to become a better podcaster is my podcasting cheat sheet. The link is in the description for that. It's a cheat sheet because I have a list of tools that are free that you can use and get good sound and audio. And there's hardware on that cheat sheet as well. So if you need the best microphones, webcams, or any other tools for your podcast, get my cheat sheet, download it, save it as a link on one of your favorites, and refer back to it often. Try out some of the tools that I have there on the cheat sheet. It's free, so you can try it out and get good sound and audio, good top quality audio. Use some of the tools and use it to help your podcasting workflow. It will help you. And that's it for this episode of I Made a Podcast. I hope that I'm pretty sure that you did learn something from this episode because I summarized everything that I learned. So I hope that you go back and listen to more of those episodes that I did from season number 1. Subscribe to I Made a Podcast on any one of the podcasting apps that you use. Just search I Made a Podcast and you'll find me there, and you can subscribe. Put a 5-star review and write some comments down or a little review of how this podcast helped you. And remember that the best time to start a podcast was 10 years ago. The second best time is right now. So go ahead and make it happen. And you'll hear from me again in season number 2 in January. Peace.